Margaret Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Some of your critics have pointed to the incredibly polarized political climate under your administration as contributing to the rise of someone as provocative as Donald Trump. Do you feel responsibility for that, or even some of the protectionist rhetoric from some Democratic candidates? Do you have a timeline for when you might make a presidential endorsement? And to follow my colleague's question here, do you feel political heat is constraining your pool of viable Supreme Court nominees? Thank you.
It's a threefer. I think it's important for me to nominate a Supreme Court nominee quickly, because I think it's important for the Supreme Court to have its full complement of justices. I don't feel constrained in terms of the pool to draw from, or that I'm having to take shortcuts in terms of the selection and vetting process. With respect to your first question, I've actually heard this argument a number of times. I have been blamed by Republicans for a lot of things, but being blamed for their primaries and who they're selecting for their party is novel. Look, I said at the State of the Union that one of my regrets is the degree to which polarization and the nasty tone of our politics is accelerated rather than waned over the course of the last 7.5 years. And I do all kinds of soul searching in terms of, are there things I can do better to make sure that we're unifying the country? But I also have to say, Margaret, that objectively, it's fair to say that the Republican political elites and many of the information outlets, social media, news outlets, talk radio, television stations have been feeding the Republican base for the last 7 years a notion that everything I do is to be opposed, that cooperation or compromise somehow is a betrayal, that maximalist, absolutist positions on issues are politically advantageous, that there is a them out there and an us, and them are the folks who are causing whatever problems you're experiencing. And the tone of that politics, which I certainly have not contributed to, I have not, I don't think that I was the one to prompt questions about my birth certificate, for example. I don't remember saying, hey, why don't you ask me about that? Why don't you, question whether I'm American or whether I'm loyal or whether I have America's best interests at heart? Those aren't things that were prompted by any actions of mine. And so what you're seeing within the Republican Party is to some degree, all those efforts over a course of time, creating an environment where somebody like a Donald Trump can thrive. He's just doing more of what has been done for the last 7.5 years. And in fact, in terms of his positions on a whole range of issues, they're not very different from any of the other candidates. I mean, it's not as if there's a massive difference between Mr. Trump's position on immigration and Mr. Cruz's position on immigration. Mr. Trump might just be more provocative in terms of how he says it, but the actual positions aren't that different. For that matter, they're not that different from Mr. Rubio's positions on immigration, despite the fact that both Mr. Cruz and Mr. Rubio, their own families, are the products of immigration and the openness of our society. So I am more than happy to own the responsibility as president, as the only office holder who is elected by all the American people, to continue to make efforts to bridge divides and help us find common ground. As I've said before, I think that common ground exists all across the country. You see it every day in how people work together and live together and play together and raise their kids together. But what I'm not going to do is to validate some notion that the Republican crack-up that's been taking place is a consequence of actions that I've taken. And I what's interesting, I'll just say one last thing about this. There are thoughtful conservatives who are troubled by this, who are troubled by the direction of their party. I think it is very important for them to reflect on what it is about the politics they've engaged in that allows the circus we've been seeing to transpire, and to do some introspection, because ultimately I want an effective Republican Party. I think this country has to have responsible parties that can govern and that are prepared to lead and govern, whether they're in the minority or in the majority, whether they occupy the White House or they do not. And I've often said I want a serious, effective Republican Party, in part to challenge some of the blind spots and dogmas in the Democratic Party. I think that's useful. You mentioned trade, for example. I believe that there have been bad trade deals on occasion in the past, that oftentimes they have served the interests of global corporations but not necessarily served the interests of workers. But I'm absolutely persuaded that we cannot put up walls around a global economy, and that to sell a bill of goods to the American people and workers that if you just shut down trade somehow your problems would go away prevents us from actually solving some of these big problems about inequality and the decline of our manufacturing base and so on. And that's an area where some traditional conservatives and economists have had some important insights. But they can't be presented effectively if it's combined with no interest in helping workers and busting up unions and providing tax breaks to the wealthy rather than providing help to folks who are working hard and trying to pay the bills. And certainly is not going to be heard if it's coupled with vehement anti-immigrant sentiment that betrays our values. So, okay. I think that the Democratic voters are doing just fine working this out. I think it's useful that we've had a vigorous debate among two good people who care deeply about our country and who have fought hard on behalf of working people in this country for a long time. I think it's been a good conversation, and my most important role will be to make sure that after primaries are done, I'm bringing everybody together so that we focus on winning the general election.